Very often they are defective people. Either they are people who simply can't function successfully in society, that is, are losers or antisocial misfits looking for company, or they are escapists or adventurers who don't really want to serve our cause, but we're looking for some politically incorrect diversion.
What's up, fellow YouTubers? Chilling like an old school rock star villain. Killing time while I bust the rock or a nickel and a dime, you know. Watch out.
I can take a bite of the table. Where's the table? Please.
You're on your nut-tubes.
Get the fuck away from me, fucking nigger.
Please enjoy. Please enjoy.
It's RFI episode 84. This week, before I get into the main musician we will be analyzing, I wanted to bring attention to a new death metal band I found out about. They are called Necrom. And you know I'm gonna like it because it sounds like late 90s Dismember, which is one of my favorite eras of that sort of death metal. This very melodic, chainsaw, nasty stuff. But you'll never guess who was in this band. You recognize those vocals? It's fucking Roman Senko from Druidic and Hate Forest. We also have Kinyaz Vargoth on guitars. We got Isverg from Burstin in the band. It's basically like a weird super group of all these Ukrainian Natsok black metal guys, but playing really good death metal. Way better than you would expect a group like that to sound. But, you know, they're pretty accomplished musicians, and they listen to a wide depth and breadth of genres of music, and that comes through in the songs they choose to cover and in their overall very genre-bending music. You know, we got, like, Nocturnal Mortem covered fucking Wasp and the Moody Blues at one point. There's, like, the weird hip-hop stuff that happened in the old Dubbuck albums. So they're very talented musicians, and unsurprisingly, this new death metal band is very good.
I have pineapple.
But sadder news, as I mentioned in the last episode of this program, Kaldrad Branislav from the old bands Forest and Branikald passed away at the end of August after getting hit by a car by probably some drunken Russian idiot, as tends to happen. And I thought, you know, it's about time I did an episode on Branikald, because that particular artist has been a major influence on me musically and philosophically, probably since like 2010-ish at least. I've been listening to them for a while. So Kaldrad was part of a group called Blazebirth Hall that was mostly him and another guy named Ulf Gegner Ermanson, who both lived in the same city. They also had a drummer guy named Wizard. It is a wizard. And there was another dude that had a band named Run Dagor, but they don't really come into the picture too much because there was sort of a falling out with that guy. And a lot of people thought he was dead for years because, you know, all the mistranslated interviews said he was dead. In fact, what happened was they essentially excommunicated him. They said he was spiritually dead. This is a similar thing that happened to the guy from Mutilation from Les Légions Noires in France, the Black Legions. He got way too into the heroin, and they just kind of kicked him out and then told everybody he was fucking dead. Same thing happened to the Run Dagor guy. But Branikald and Ravendark, the two main bands, and Forest, which was also a collaboration between the two musicians, that's sort of like the core of the Blazebirth Hall sound. They were big into the idea of an organized scene structure. That's why they came up with a name for what they were doing, sort of an artistic collective. And in fact, Branikald in particular was almost an example of total art in the Wagnerian sense, because not only did he record all the music and write all the lyrics and such, put out all the music himself, but he painted the album covers, and they're actually very interesting paintings. They're sort of in between kind of a Vasily Kandinsky abstraction with a lot of paint swooshes and very odd angular structures mixed with a lot of space stuff, a lot of aquatic stuff, and a lot of Nordic imagery. Now, you can probably tell, you know, these guys are Russian, but they've taken names like Kaldrad Branislav and Ulf Gegner because they had a great reverence for the Norwegian scene. And in fact, they might have been some of the earliest exponents of Norwegian black metal outside of Norway, given that, there's Branikald and Ravendark stuff from like 1993. That's when like Euronymous is still, his corpse is still warm at that point. This right here is the most famous track probably of Branikald's whole discography, because it was covered by Crota on their Fimbulvinter album. This is the second song on their first demo. It's called A Storm Ride, and the demo itself is called Stormheit. So, very, very folky sort of riff. And a lot of use of sound layering already. We have the main guitar melody and that counterpoint sort of going on in the background. And of course, it's a very raw sound. Branikald is usually pretty raw, but luckily nothing is quite as raw as this album. They'd probably be very hard to listen to if it was all this raw. I love that they had that wind sound running the whole time, too. That's actually made with a synthesizer. You can hear the same sort of thing on a lot of old Klaus Schulze albums. Elsewhere on that first EP, they got in some very triumphant sounding stuff. This one's called A Crushing Hammer. And even at this embryonic stage, you can see Kaldrad's fondness for longer form riffs that are very repetitive, but they have lots of twists and turns to them. So even though they are played many times, they don't get boring. And in fact, the repetition helps you understand what's going on, because oftentimes it can be very complex. That's actually a feature of Slavonic music in general. If you were to compare the works of Alexander Borodin to, say, one of the Germanic composers like Mozart or whatever, the Germanic stuff is very oriented on counterpoint and leitmotif development, whereas the Slavic stuff will meditate heavily on a single melody and just kind of repeat that, and through that repetition, new elements of it are exposed. So in a way, these guys are repeating a dichotomy that existed between Eastern and Western styles of classical music way back when. That said, there's also a great deal of continuity in the Slavic culture, with a lot of the Nordic stuff up north, and then a lot of the Mediterranean stuff down south in the Balkans and such. The relationship between Croatia and Italy is fairly well attested to historically. But up for your northern and eastern Slavs, which is what these guys are, they are in fact descended partially from Viking stock, and it was this stock that Branikald themselves are interested in ideologically and spiritually, which is why they would use Norwegian song titles, not only out of deference to the past Norwegian masters like Varg and Fenris and such, Darkthrone and Burzum being the two very noticeable influences on the Blazebirth Hall stuff, but also just because they were looking into some of the Nordic aspect of their roots in addition to the Slavic ones. Once you get to their actual full-length albums, well, it's mostly just him doing everything, that Kaldrad guy, very talented fellow. Once you get into his full-length albums, the Branikald style starts to become more original. And also, in a way, his method of composing music is sort of a meta-commentary on the older Norwegian black metal stuff. For instance, you might remember on Transylvanian Hunger, stuff like this. Transylvanian Hunger, of course, being the most famous Darkthrone album, and probably the one that influenced Blazebirth Hall the most. So repetitive melodic riffs terminating in this very interesting sort of ending where the song unravels itself. Now, in the case of Darkthrone, these were simple little compositional flourishes, but Branikald thought it was a pretty interesting idea and took it to greater heights, wherein the song sort of weaves itself together with a very ostentatious intro and then an unraveling sort of section later on, wherein themes are subtracted incrementally as the song ends. This fits into the Blazebirth Hall idea of a song being an ornament for the cosmos. We'll get more to that unraveling stuff later, but first let's hear an idea he had for that intro that I thought was pretty interesting. So what you're hearing now is just a minor scale being played up and down very fast. In keeping with the cosmic attitude of Branikald, they're using the most basic elemental forms of music, and then as we get farther into the song, those ideas are woven into this very vast melody. Also, that idea from Darkthrone of using drums more as texture and timekeeper than as sort of a showboat and main time sort of like beat giver. The pulse of the music comes from the guitars. The drums are just kind of there, brushing the cymbals very lightly. It's sort of a texture thing, allowing the guitars to take over as the central voice, further leaving rock music behind. You can also hear that Burzum influence in the way they layer those guitars very subtly. There's actually a lot more going on than you might notice on initial listen in terms of layers of sound in Branikald. It's even more subtle than Burzum at points. Also interesting to note, the Slavic bands, or specifically the Russian ones of the Blazebirth Hall style, do not utilize bar chords as much as the Norwegian ones. It's based more on power chords, but not played in a percussive death metal way. Rather, they are continuously picked in an endless stream of melody. This song intro almost seems to be a commentary. This is from later on in their discography. It seems like it's a commentary on that early intro, because instead of a very melodic sort of minor key type thing, he's just going up and down a chromatic scale and then slicing and dicing that little chromatic figure with that tremolo pick winding melody. His vocals are amazing, by the way. He also did guest vocals in Temnas, or I think he showed up on a couple of Nocturnal Mortem albums at one point. The Eastern European black metal scene seems to be a bit more interconnected than other scenes are. One of the major innovations of Branikald in particular was the inclusion of these sort of ambient tracks built entirely around guitar with minimal effects on it. Occasionally he'll reproduce riffs from earlier, more distorted portions of the album to unlock some of the new melodies from it. But more often than not, they are separate compositions. And they're actually just as interesting as the black metal stuff. He really has an ear for ambiance in the old sort of Klaus Schulze style, but done in a much more minimalistic manner. This is the closing track on their third album. It's called Cosm Hall, or Entrance to Cosm Hall. And then that first track you heard a while back was called Kita and Cosm, so sort of a circle here. Let's move a little bit later into this track to see how he can also make ambient music that is very aggressive sounding. Jeez, when you speed that up, it sounds weird bell noise. There we go. Very cool stuff. I'm a really big fan of his approach to this sort of ambient black metal thing, which has minimal to no percussion. Instead, it's just these streams of melody on undistorted guitar that usually has a very emotive quality to it. I would say that the best Branikald album is probably, well, it has multiple names. The original Norwegian title is Blik av Kald. The actual title that they yell on the album, the Russian one, is Hladvazor, which in English means Vision of Frost. So all three very good titles. At this point, he's almost left that Darkthrone influence behind and is crafting his own sort of melody, which would go on to influence Ukrainian bands like Drudik, and as well as other Russian bands like Black Death. There's that Hladvazor for you. Getting back to that idea of a song unraveling at its ends as you pull out threads from the cosmic tapestry into nothingness, that particular track is a very interesting unraveling section. Very good stuff. This song is called Stemme av Kald, Call of Frost. And here's the unraveling section, which, as you can already tell, is considerably more complex than the rudimentary attempts made towards a similar concept by Darkthrone. As the guitars sort of like swoop and weave around each other, the percussion is pulled out, leaving only those streams of melody, which are slowly fading away, but at the same time also providing variations on the main theme of that song. In true Platonic form, derp, we have, that was the stemma of called, which was very loud and brash. When we finally get to the vision of Frost rather than the call of it, we are beholding the perfect Platonic form of Frost instead of trying to use black metal to describe it, and that gives us another good ambient track. There, of course, is also the occult significance of the concept of the vision and the voice, which I will not go into in depth here. Very strong music. So that's probably the best Branikald album is Blick of Kald. Of Winter Called is also a really good one to start with, but one of the albums that I am most interested in from him is actually his last Branikald album, which was moving into a different style that he would develop further in Nitberg and also his collaborations with Goroth and Temnozor. This album was called Triumph Voli, Triumph of the Will. This song is called My Honor is Called Loyalty, which is a very naughty phrase in the original German for some reason. I'm not sure why. The drums on this album are completely different. They remind me of Capricornus from Graveland. And overall, there's more of a storming, triumphant feel as opposed to the very dehumanized darkness of earlier Branikald releases. And the vocals are a lot more folky and shouty. But I think it's fun to have a Branikald album that sounds a little bit different than all the other ones. This is probably my second favorite album of theirs. But then you have sections like this that are still vintage dark Branikald, just with a new coat of paint. This album is unfortunately rather overlooked by the Branikald fan base. It sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, but I think it functions effectively as a bridge into his later musical projects. Very cool stuff. Elsewhere on this album, he blends that sort of triumphant thing with the more ambient style of composition. This one's called Raven Fierce. It's sort of the centerpiece of the album between the ambient tracks and the more punk-influenced ones. Some very emotive vocals from him. Once again, foreshadowing his later work with Temnozor. The transition from this distorted ambience back into folky black metal is probably one of my favorite moments in the genre, and it's about to happen right now. Look at that. It's good stuff. That dank Burzum beat. His vocals here are really cool too when they kick in a minute. Very operatic. Maybe not technically good in the traditional classically trained vocalist sense, but I think they communicate the emotion he's going for very well. That idea of survival in the face of overwhelming odds, triumph of the will. You gotta have some haze in there, those are always fun. And that about does it for Branikald. So Kaldrad has passed away, and Ulf Gegner Ermanson was also killed under mysterious circumstances in 2005. So tragedy follows that scene around, but their work lives on and speaks for itself, I think. So go and check that out if you haven't already.
One of the most interesting developments I've seen since September 11th is the public hinting by people in the Federal Bureau of Investigation that it really would be helpful to them if they were permitted to torture suspects or other people from whom they wanted information, like the police in Israel.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I am going to try to do here today, I cannot possibly hope to convert you or convert any significant number of you, have you come up here and say, could I please have an armband, and I want to join the Nazis. I can't do that today. The best thing that I can do is show you some of the startling facts some of the staggering, shocking facts which were withheld from me when I was in college and when I was a citizen, out of business and so forth, that I didn't know that you don't know.